I was debating whether to post this for some time. I've heard that this is a place to talk about strange things. Maybe someone out there has been having similar experiences, and they can offer me answers to what's been happening. I've been a zookeeper for 29 years. I won't say my name or my exact location or where I work at, for reasons that will become clear. It's a profession that I've embraced with open arms. The sense of purpose derived from caring for animals is something that I can't even describe. For all those years, we have gone without incident. That was until the night of the break-in. Last month, around 3 a.m., the security system was triggered. I dragged myself out of bed and to the scene the second the call came in. And I'm not afraid to admit that I broke more than a few speeding laws driving there. My first worry had been the animals, if they had been hurt. From my own past experiences, there were more than a few sick people like that out there. A million scenarios flashed through my mind, each more horrible than the last. I skidded to a halt as flashing red and blue lights winded in my vision, illuminating the entrance sign, and I rushed out. I had been met by the sight of a young police officer who looked fresh out of the academy, standing and scratching his head. His eyes snapped open when he saw me leaning against the fluttering yellow tape, cordoning off the scene. "Hey!" he barked. "You're not supposed to go in there." "I work here, senior zookeeper," I shot back, flashing on my tags. "What happened?" The cop stood there in silence, trying to formulate an answer. His shoulders sagged in defeat. "To be honest, I don't even know," he admitted. The police found no evidence of any intruder present, but on all the walls of every exhibit, they found spiraling symbols scrawled on and still dripping red paint. The animals were all still asleep inside, oblivious to whoever had entered, even the more hostile ones, like the lions and the gorillas. In under an hour, whoever had broken in had managed to tag the wall of every exhibit before slipping back into the night. They checked the security cameras, but all that they saw were lines of vibrating static. They had brushed it off as a teenage prank, despite the glaring evidence otherwise. The next morning was spent scrubbing it off in our routine cleanup, but the outline of the scarlet traces lingered for days afterwards against the stony gray. It all began with the bird enclosure. The preening parrots would stand motionless on their perches. They didn't seem to even breathe, just standing there with their beady eyes following every movement. And then they would swing back and forth in a mass, undulating movement that seemed almost rehearsed, never breaking eye contact. The effect extended to the rest of the birds that we had, from the black-headed weaver to the American condor. Whenever someone entered, they would just stop whatever they were doing and whip their beaked heads around to stare unrelentingly before starting their bizarre shaking. Some of us joked about it, making the inevitable, the birds comparisons, and it was the beginning of an avian uprising. At the same time though, we were still concerned. We wondered if it was the stress of the recent break-in, or something in their dietary habits, or a habit that was causing the unusual phenomenon. After numerous checks, we found nothing out of the ordinary. But it didn't end with the birds. Whenever we passed by, the animals would fall silent. The lions would prowl the ground, their tails flicking. The bonobos would peer behind from the coverage of the trees. Even when we would wash them each morning, they would stand there rigid in trickling water, not even flinching. The familiarity and trust that we had long built up with them over the years was long gone from their eyes, replaced with something that sent a shiver down my spine. It was as if something else was wearing their skin. It was on one particularly busy day, in the final stages of the summer rush where families crowded the zoo, and before all the children went back to school. I was in my office filing paperwork, but the resulting screams were loud enough to penetrate through my office window and alert me that something was wrong long before the message would crackle through on my radio. One of the gorillas, Henrik, a young male silverback, had started to display extreme distress. He clawed at his face hard enough to leave gouges in his skin, and he batted his fist against his chest. He howled as if he was seeing something terrible. And then in front of multiple children, he had repeatedly smashed his head into the glass, hard enough to send jagged cracks racing through the pane. He had done it until his forehead had almost completely split open. Blood smeared across the cracked surface, and it trickled down onto the ground. We managed to sedate him before he broke through, but by then, the real damage had already been done. The sight of him lying on the cold metal slab in our zoo veterinarian's office, eyes closed, with a trailing line of stitches ending just above the bridge of his nose, it broke my heart. I had been present when he had been born, and had watched him grow to an adult in the past few years. He was almost a son to me. Despite our best attempts, nobody could explain his sudden outburst. The gorilla enclosure was sealed off for repairs for the next few days, as Henrik recovered. The usual morning meeting next day was devoid of the usual playful ribbing and jovial mood, replaced by cold realization and uncertainty. I tried to keep order as best as I could, but even I was unnerved by the new atmosphere that had settled. We were all becoming afraid of the place that we had once loved. The strange behavior continued. The birds continued to sway, as if pulled back and forth by some invisible hand, their feathers falling to the ground where they had violently pecked, pieces of skin still attached. The snakes curled themselves into tight, bound balls, burying their heads within their tails. The primates would just sit on tree stumps, their limbs wrapped around their bodies in an almost fetal position, and scream to the skies. Between the screams, they made quieter noises that almost sounded like whispers or giggling. Sometimes I swore that I could see the muscles under their skin shift and stretch. At the time, I dismissed it as just a trick of the light. Their lips would recede into horrific fanged grins so wide that their faces seemed to be straining not to split apart from the exertion. I had come down to the marsupial exhibit one day, one of the most popular, only to find that a chinchilla had devoured her own newborn kit, her gray-white fur still flecked with gore. She had glared up at me, dark eyes devoid of light. I recalled reading an article once where animals displayed unusual behaviors before a natural disaster, usually an earthquake. It was thought that some vertebrate varieties could sense natural disturbances long before they happened. It made some sense, being in a state known for its significant seismic activity. but this transcended beyond what was natural. It had been one late night in the office, as I had been poring over documents. The adjacent window allows me a near bird's eye view of the entire zoo. In front of the full peeking moon through my half-closed blinds, the elongated silhouette of a giraffe stumbled into view. It stood there, the glowing orbs of its eyes hovering about in the darkness. I had worked there almost 30 years, but never had I ever been so terrified of such a docile animal as I had been in that moment. Its head reared back, and I could only watch as its skull started to split in half, the skin peeling backwards from its face. Its neck soon followed afterwards, unfurling like the petals of a flower, the exposed red esophagus pulsating up in the moonlight. From out of the exposed neck stem, slick black tentacles flared up into the chilly night air. It continued for a few horrific, mesmerizing minutes while I could only watch, my brain still working to understand what was taking place in front of me. As quickly as it had happened, the creature snapped back to its former form, like nothing had happened, and it continued to graze at the ground before padding back into the darkness. I have no idea what the hell is going on, but I'm sure that the break-in had something to do with it. Something happened on that night that was outside human explanation. Their cries grow louder each day, all blending into one horrific noise that fills the air. They're becoming something else, and I don't know for how much longer we can keep them locked up. I did no rest for months following that terrible night. The faces of the animals slipped into my dreams, their skin twisting and deforming in ways that were beyond what was natural. Their lips would move in an all too human way, forming inaudible words, talking to me about something. Night after night, I would wake up drenched in my own sweat. I knew that something was wrong, and by now, the rest of my staff were catching on too. But the higher-ups were determined to squeeze all the money they could out of the last few months of summer. Closure was unthinkable. All our worst fears were confirmed when the warning alarms droned into my office, almost rattling the pane of glass from my window. My heart plunged down into the icy pit of my stomach. I knew too well what that sound meant. It was one that every person who's ever worked in a zoo hopes to never hear. One of the animals had escaped. A sudden burst of static drew my attention to the radio, half hidden under a mound of paperwork. I pulled it to my ear and I heard a sobbing male voice amidst the hissing interference. The breathing was so rapid that I struggled to make out the words that he was saying.
Hello? It's Toby, sir.
Toby, one of the newest interns here. He was a gangly kid with a shock of red hair, fresh out of college and with a permanent nervous quiver to him. Despite my own growing fears, I couldn't help but feel bad for him. He sounded like he was terrified out of his mind.
Toby, what's going on out there?
He sucked in air, trying to control his whimpers.
It's a code red.
I ran a hand over my reverting hairline. The situation was so much worse than I had assumed it to be. A code red was the highest threat on the scale. It meant that a dangerous animal escaped, usually a big cat. As I raced from the office, my immediate concerns, as per protocol, were the protection of my staff, the attendees, and the animal. I knew that the situation had to be handled delicately. One mistake could result in injury or death. I knew that the lion was roaming around disoriented and was bound to attack if we sprung out at it. When an animal was cornered, that was when it was at its most dangerous. We had to employ stealth in containing them. Another voice crackled over the radio.
Code Red, Lion in the reptile house. I repeat, Code Red Lion in the reptile house. Do you copy?
Unlike Toby, this voice was female and a lot more recognizable. Annie, our zoo veterinarian, someone who knew what she was doing.
Copy.
I gritted into the radio. My eyes surveyed the normally bustling grounds, now completely emptied of people. Candy packaging and leaflets rolled across the ground in the wind, which patted against the sun-streaked glass of the exhibit. I was more than glad that any civilians had been evacuated, but I couldn't shake off that growing discomfort. And that's when it hit me. The animals were all silent, just watching me from inside of their own habitats. A panda stared out with deadened black bead eyes while gnawing a shard of bamboo while the birds swayed on their branches. I turned around to find a chimpanzee, his face compressed against the glass, flaring nostrils clouding against the surface. His lips receded into a fanged grin. They were like an avid audience to the whole spectacle, all waiting to see how it played out. I walked on, trying not to make eye contact with any of them, and soon found the reptile house rounding into my peripheral vision. A blue tarpaulin already constructed. By now, the emergency zoo response team had already assembled, unloading their tranquilizer guns. I saw Annie holding a syringe, a powerful sedative oozing from its pointed tip. My shoulders sagged in relief. "Annie, please tell me you know what's going on." She shook her head with such vigor that a neatly tucked strand of auburn bun came loose, falling over an eyebrow. "No idea. Samson just went insane, smashed through the glass like it was nothing," she murmured. She gestured down to a spotted path of blood that disappeared into the open doorway of the exhibit. "Took some pretty heavy lacerations. I'm afraid about him bleeding out." "And then we better move quickly," I told her. She nodded, her expression as stoic as ever, a beacon of professionalism, standing over the waves of fear that threatened to wash over us. I raised my hands in the air. "No sudden movements," I told them. I was determined to keep order amongst them. The most important part of dealing with a potentially dangerous animal was not to panic. I knew that losing your cool was what got people killed. Our steps were slow and timed, as not to startle the lion. We followed the wavering beams of our flashlights into the flickering hall of the reptile house. The ceiling lights had been damaged in the initial rush of evacuation, leaving it sputtering randomly between being brightly lit and near total darkness. Our group froze when our light shone on the defined back of a 500-pound male adult lion. One of the other keepers had the tranquilizer gun cocked in his trembling hands when it turned to us. I wanted to call the thing that stood in front of us Samson, but I knew that I couldn't. It wasn't him anymore. Blood streamed down the sides of its face from its eyes, half dried in its tawny fur. There was so much of it that the orange-brown of its eyes was now red. Its mouth was stretched into a jagged grin, so wide that it looked like its face had split open trying to do so, exposing pale pink jaw muscle. I had never seen any animal move the way that it did, and I hope that I never do again. Its heavy pounding paws jerked around with every step into unnatural angles. It was as it was moving around on broken limbs. His eyes bounced around as it prowled, rolling around as if they were loose in the skull. Clumps of its darkened mane were scattered to the ground, exposing blistered flesh. Toby's sneakers scraped against the floor, but I grabbed the collar of his shirt just as he was about to take off into a full sprint. I didn't realize he was there until I saw his pale face blinking out in the darkness. But right now, I didn't have time to chew out the rest for bringing an intern along with them. "Don't run. Walk away slowly," I told him. I knew he would never be fast enough if he decided to go after him. Its lower jaw jutted to the point that it looked ready to fall off, and then the noise filtered through the air, loud and barking. It was laughing at us, in some low, deep animal imitation of a human voice, exposing a line of sharp, glimmering teeth. Its head began to shake so much that it blurred. Its eyeballs squelched to the floor, leaving behind two black, vacant holes. Behind me, Toby purged the contents of his stomach onto the floor. We were all frozen, unable to turn away from the horrific spectacle unfolding in front of us. Two dark, thorny spikes were expelled from out of the emptied sockets. It was like we were watching some sped-up footage of a plant growing. Something that should have taken years was happening in seconds. We watched as it extended and thickened to the point that it strained the bone. They soon jutted out almost a foot in front of its head. Unable to stomach anymore, Toby wrestled the gun off one of the other keepers and fired 3 darts into it before I could stop him. Instead of stopping it, a ripple ran through its body, like an air hose had been inserted into it, inflating the layers of skin and muscle. The darts that had been embedded within it popped out and scattered onto the floor. And then it charged us. Toby barely had a chance to react, as bony limbs jutting from its now blind eyes gored right through him. His eyes widened as they shredded his lungs, the sharp tips bursting out of his back. His mouth fell open, red streaming out and staining his shirt. It shook him off, leaving his broken body to soak in a growing pool of his own blood. It sniffed at the air, horns still dripping. We scattered as it bowled through us. Most of us found ourselves with our backs pressed up against the walls, but one found his leg clenched within its powerful jaws. It shook him like a cat with a bird, raking its claws over his face. Bloodied strips of skin fell to the floor. His screams rang through the darkness. I closed my eyes, already erecting a mental block. My feet shifted against the floor, knees tensing up at the slightest sound that they made. But I forced myself to keep moving. In the waning light, I saw Annie on the other side of the thing, her arms splayed up against the wall, trying to avoid being detected. The thin glass cylinder of the syringe jutting out of its back just below its neck, but the massive dosage of drugs didn't seem to register in its changed body. Pressing a finger to my lips, I waved my hand along to her. The thing tore into the keeper's innards, maw flecked with gore. I flinched every time its nostrils flared, thinking that our presence had been exposed. While it was distracted, we rounded up what remained of our number and we left as quietly as we could. The potential pain of being torn apart by whatever Samson had become now was nothing compared to the one I felt at leaving 2 of us behind. But the lack of stable lighting would buy us some time, or so I hoped. As we ran down the hallway, I could already hear the pounding paws echoing from around the corners. The snakes writhed up their glass walls, rhythmically tapping against it. The streaming light at the end of the passageway was already fading with the metallic whirring of the falling shutters. The only coherent thought that I could hear over the rush of adrenaline and blood was please, please God, let us get out of here alive. After what seemed like a lifetime in the darkness, the outside light invaded my eyes, almost blinding me. I lost my footing and I ended up half sprawled out onto the ground. The others stumbled out behind me. Annie clutched her chest, trying to control her own frantic breathing. The iron screen shook as its head smashed into it, to the point that I was sure it would burst open. This was followed by a piercing series of grinding sounds, which was probably it trying to claw its way out. After managing to catch my breath, my managerial mode kicks back in with a vengeance. Come on, we need to get to the main building. There will be supplies there, a phone. We can call somebody for help. My words seemed to hang in the air. The others stood frozen around me, staring out to the exhibits, mouths open. I felt myself go cold at their expressions. I forced myself up on my trembling knees. The sun streamed through the gaping hole in the surface of the glass pane of the chimpanzee exhibit. Fragmented glass was now scattered all over the ground, which glowed in the patterned light that streamed through the swaying trees. The chimpanzees were already long gone. As I was fumbling for my radio, Annie's firm hand pulled me around and I saw that the rest of the animals had vanished too. In every exhibit, there was an almost identical hole torn through. A wind howled through the emptied habitats. The world weighed down on my back to the point where I felt my spine buckle under it. We were rooted to the spot. The sensation of dozens of unseen eyes burning into our flesh, hidden in plain sight, and ready to pounce and tear us to shreds at any given moment. There was only one word left in my mind that could sum up our predicament. Fuck.